I've been told by the organizer. Once again, thank you to join to our discussion, which entitled as Civil Society Leads, which basically a research collaboration between Indonesia and scholars from Lund University, which also involve many institutions like Asia Research Center, University of Indonesia, the Center for Political Studies, aka Puskapol UI, University of Indonesia, Polgov UGM, University of Gajah Mada, and Korawal Foundation. So today, we're going to start our discussion related to a new kind of discourse in Indonesia, which the researcher called as civil society elites. This is quite interesting subject, which basically when we are talking about elites, we tend to equate it at something that relate to political institution, economic institution, or other quite high level institution. But now this team of research start to elaborate the position of the elites in terms of civil society, which basically most of us thinking that as a form of organization can be considered not an elite institution. So as you might all know, this discussion will be presented by Professor Anders Ulin, which for those who are familiar with his work, is well known for writing a book, Oposisi Berserak, what is in Indonesia? What is in English? Fragmented Opposition, if I'm not mistaken. And right now he's become one of the researcher in a subject on civil society elites. And also there is, sorry, I can't, Astrid, which is also part of Lund University as well. And also Mbak Amalinda Safirani with from UGM. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Professor Anders to start his presentation on. Oh, sorry. Really sorry. I'm really sorry. So before, I'm really sorry, Professor. So before we proceed our discussion here, there's some, opening remarks from the organizer here. So from IRC, our friends from IRC, Tika will present her opening remarks. Please, the floor is yours.
Hi, greetings everyone. I am really sorry for disrupting the excitement, because it's an obligation, I guess, to me to welcome everybody in the room to join the discussion. I would like to thank you again for everyone involved in organizing and participating in this discussion. And I am glad that we have the opportunity as an academic institution based at UI to organize this event in a way where we could actually contribute to civil society in a constructive and collaborative way. So again, thank you for everyone, and I hope you all enjoyed the discussion. I would also like to invite Mbak Uria to say a few words, or no? Okay, so let's just start the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tika. And so, Professor Anders, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you so much for organizing this seminar, and thank you very much to everyone attending here and online. So what we're going to present today is the outcome of a research project on civil society elites in Indonesia and Cambodia. Do we have the PowerPoint presentation here, so we can move on to the next slide. This is a research project funded by the Swedish Research Council, and as Mohammed mentioned, this is a collaboration between Lund University and UGM and research partners in Cambodia as well. No. So it's a 3 years project, and it has been extended or postponed because of COVID, but now we are reaching the final stage of this, and we will report based on the forthcoming book, an edited volume, edited by Linda, Astrid, and myself. And yeah, here you can see pictures of all the contributors to this book. And I'm very pleased to see the whole Yogya team present here in the room. So we only miss a few colleagues from Cambodia here. Slide, please. And yeah, this is just a table of content. I think we skip that one and move on to the concept of civil society elite. So the plan for this presentation, I will go over some of the conceptual, theoretical, methodological, and then Linda will present our findings. Then we move on to more specific case studies from Desi. So that's the plan for the presentation. So the concept of a civil society elite, this is something that's to many is quite provocative, I think, combining civil society and elite. And also if you search for academic publications with the keyword civil society and elite, all of them are about civil society against the elite, not studying elites within civil society. And this is of course because much civil society research has focused on the grassroots level. What we do instead is to try to shed more light on the top of civil society and the people who are at the top of civil society, which also means that we pay attention to and put into research focus power relations and inequality within civil society and also beyond civil society, of course. So we think that this approach is fruitful for these reasons. We understand a civil society elite to be a group of people in dominant position in civil society and often exercising significant influence also beyond civil society. So it's a matter of power relations, and I will soon move on. Soon get back to some more elaborated discussions about this approach. Next, please. So the main research that we pose in this book is: how are civil society elites formed? How do civil society elites interact or even integrate with other elite groups in politics, economics, and the state? And how does reliance on foreign funding influence processes of elite formation and interaction? So we are interested not primarily in who belongs to the civil society elite or not. It's more a process perspective of who are civil society elites formed and how do they interact and maybe move on to become political elites or elites in government. So this is what we call boundary crossing, that we will tell you more about. And we also highlight the role of foreign funding organizations in creating elites. Next, please. So we have two comparative dimensions. One is across the two countries, Indonesia and Cambodia. And the rationale for this is that they have experienced different trajectories when it comes to political space for civil society. We have a generally shrinking political space in Cambodia and a relatively expanding political space for civil society in Indonesia, if we take at least this kind of 20-year perspective. Then, of course, we are aware of shrinking space also in Indonesia now. So that's the first comparative dimension. The other one is to compare across civil society sectors. So we look at, for example, the agrarian sector, agricultural sector, youth organization as a specific sector, human rights, and so on. And please. I think our point of departure is a quite conventional understanding of civil society as situated somewhere in between the family, the state, and the market, including not only kind of formalized, institutionalized non-governmental organizations, but also social movements, activist networks, and so on. And we also point out that unlike some approaches to civil society, we do not consider civil society actors as only value-driven. They might also be driven by instrumental interests in competition for funding and so on. And many civil society actors, of course, try to influence politics. What distinguishes them from political parties is that they do not run in elections, although prominent civil society figures might run in elections and move on to the political sphere. Next, please. And elites are then made up of actors who hold dominant positions over subordinate positions in a field shaped by how social, economic, cultural, and or symbolic capital is valued and dispersed among actors. So this is an understanding of elite that is drawing on the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu and his work on fields and capital. And this is a prominent perspective within elite research, but has not been that frequently applied to civil society. And elite research focuses a lot on elite reproduction, how elites are reproduced within the family, within the schools. A lot of research on elite schools in different countries and so on. And we ask the question if civil society organizations sometimes might also serve as a site for elite reproduction. Another theme is the integration of elites across elite groups. So what happens when there is a lot of interaction between political elites, economic elites, and civil society elites? Do they become more similar in terms of what kind of values and attitudes they have and so on? And does this mean some kind of elite integration? And we analyze this, as I mentioned before, focusing on some individual boundary crossers who have moved from civil society into politics or government or business, for that matter. Next, please. I've already talked about field theory, so I think we skip this one and the following also. And just to say something about more specifically, we draw on Bourdieu and the strategic action field approach, but we also highlight the importance of gender relations and age differences, which are often not highlighted in this kind of research. But this is something that we find in most of our cases, the importance of this. Next, please. So something briefly about the fieldwork design then. We use specific organizations or networks or platforms in society as some kind of entry points for the broad field in which they are active. It could be the civil society field at large. It could also be the human rights field or the agrarian field and so on. And the empirical material is documents and a lot of semi-structured interviews, 110 in total, focus group discussions, also observations during field work. And yes, ethical considerations. We have had a lot of discussions about research ethics in relation to the elite label being stigmatizing for civil society leaders. And this, of course, is not what we are trying to do. We would not like to undermine the important work of civil society organizations, but to point out the importance of power relations and stratification within civil society. So we try to use the elite label or concept as a value-free concept. We do not take for granted that being a member of elite is something that is very negative or very positive. And, but of course we are aware of the negative connotations in terms of unjust privileges and so on. But on the other hand, we also speak about elites in sports, for instance, and then it's very positive to be a member of the sports elite and so on. Next slide, please. So the case selection then, you can read it here. We have the agricultural sector, the youth sector in both Cambodia and Indonesia. In Indonesia, we've added human rights and anti-corruption fields. And these are the main organizations that are included in the study. So I think that's all for my part here, the introduction, and I now leave the floor to Astrid first to say something about the findings.
Thank you, Anders. My name is Astrid Nora Nilsson. I'm a lecturer at the Center for East and Southeast Asian Studies at Lund University. And I'm a political scientist by training, so I work primarily on Cambodia, and I was also responsible for the Cambodia part of this project. So my empirical knowledge is mostly limited to Cambodia, but it's there are very interesting comparative dimensions. And so I want to say thank you for the welcome, and I'm very glad to see you all here. And very glad to find again our old research team that I hadn't seen for 4 years since we first met in Yogyakarta. So very exciting to finally wrap this up. And so I'll try to be concise, and what I will do together with Linda is to present some of the conclusions that we were able to draw from this project. So we would proceed by, well, I would proceed by the research questions that Anders introduced one by one. So if you remember, our first research question was, how are civil society elites formed? And so the case studies that we included, they included a variety of types of elite formation. So we could see that these range from formal recruitment to different training programs to socialization to different activities. and also to the informal appointment of new leaders, which we're also very interested in. So we found that it's through all these different processes that certain individuals are then able to reach these dominant field positions so that we can call them elites as per our framework. We also found that the formation of elites is best understood in relation to the different types of capital that they possess and the respective value that they hold, that these different types of capital hold in any given field. So it's really this possession of capital that differentiates who is elite from who is not an elite. And an interesting finding here was that we found social and knowledge capital to be important in all cases covered in the book, whereas economic capital seemed to be less significant for the civil society elites. And we were also able to trace out in a different empirical studies how these different civil society actors mobilize and combine different types of capital to make them reinforce each other. And I think that's important. It shows that taking that approach can be an important way of understanding the dynamics within different sectors in civil society. So next slide, please. And so the interaction of these leading civil society activists with elite actors in other fields was also often key to accumulating more types of capital, and I will return to that. Several case studies also showed the importance of founders of an organization or an initiative for the reproduction of elites, of leading activists within their own organization and beyond. And so this was, for example, very clear in the case of the urban youth organizations in both countries. Leaders were referred to as sort of parents in some cases. There was talk about generations of leaders and so on. And lastly, we also found that the formation of elites in Cambodia and Indonesia has followed very different historical trajectories. So in Indonesia, the reform era was a period of political momentum for the development of civil society, and some of the current generation within Indonesian civil society emerged from the pro-democracy movement. And also activists in fields that developed later still seem to have strong roots in opposition to the Suharto regime. Whereas in Cambodia, by contrast, modern civil society emerged largely in the 1990s, and it was highly donor-driven, and we also see that civil society has been increasingly restricted since at least the mid-2010s. So these different trajectories provide of political development provide very different contexts then for the processes of elite formation in the two countries. I think we go to the next slide. Right, so our second research question was, how do civil society elites interact or integrate with other elite groups in politics, economics, and the state? And so here we found that interactions between civil society elites and other elites varied a lot in scope and intensity, from limited and irregular on one end of the spectrum to practices even of boundary crossing or crossing to the political field or to the economic field on the other. And so we also found, and we elaborate on this in a chapter that I co-authored with Pat Haryanto and Juru, who's present here, and maybe he will talk about it more later in the discussion. But we conceptualized together then that civil society is a field for some activists in which they could then accumulate and mobilize different forms of capital that could then enable them to cross to another field. And we found that in both countries, such practice of boundary crossing, especially to the state, seemed to be motivated by perception that the state field or the field of electoral politics would be more efficient fields of action to promote the changes that activists also tried to pursue from within civil society prior to that. We found that interactions integration, they take place both at the national and local levels. We found power inequalities between the civil society field, the economic field, and the field of electoral in interactions with state elites. And this was, for example, then I'll mention our case study of agricultural civil society elites in Cambodia. That a member of the civil society elite who moved into the economic field could interact very closely with members of the state, whereas another activist who moved to oppositional politics saw the civil society organization that he had founded almost disintegrate after it was met with such distrust by the state. And finally, just as in the case of who becomes a civil society elite, we found that the forms of capital that were the most valued or the most precious for enabling boundary crossing and integration were social capital and knowledge capital, and they seem to be, again, more important than economic capital for boundary crossing. Okay, so, next slide, please. And finally, I would just lay out a few differences that we found between Cambodia and Indonesia, which we then attributed to the different structures of their civil society fields, and again related to the different political contexts that I mentioned earlier. We found that the process of capital accumulation differs. So whereas in Indonesia, the capital accumulation of civil society elites seemed to be relatively independent of the state and political fields, in Cambodia, the interactions with the state elites and the political elites were often crucial. Second, we found that the nature of elite interaction differs. So in Indonesia, speaking in a very sort of summarizing complexity here, interactions between members of the civil society elites and the state and political elites have been transformed from antagonistic to symbiotic in the post-authoritarian period. Whereas in Cambodia, we see that civil society is really divided between those organizations that are endorsed by the state and those that are framed as being in opposition to the state. Thirdly, we also found that the pathways to boundary crossing from civil society to the state and to the field of politics differ. So in Indonesia, we see that civil society elites are involved in a variety of mainstream political parties, and others have been appointed as technical experts also without joining any party. But in Cambodia, the pattern is rather that these activists, either they cross to oppositional politics or they cross to the state. It's very difficult to be appointed as a technical expert to the state if you do not join the ruling party. And so finally, there are also different then political implications of elite interaction and elite integration. So in Indonesia, we find that civil society elites seem to be divided between those who support boundary crossing as a form of critical collaboration with the state and those who believe that civil society should stay outside of the state. And this divide is fueled by activists' failure sometimes to promote fundamental change from within the state. But I know that there's more research going on this precise point, so again, maybe our Indonesian team can elaborate on their emerging findings on just how efficient that kind of activity can be. In Cambodia, we see that civil society elites who crossed to oppositional politics and sometimes even founded grassroots democratic parties, they were previously very influential, but their significance has been eroded in the past few years. So that is one set of political implications to consider in the case of Cambodia, and the other one is the implications following from the large range of state-sponsored organizations from which members of elites are now able to cross to the state and that are deeply involved in politics in Cambodia today. So with that, I hand over to Linda.
Yes. Thank you, Astrid. Thank you, first of all, Asia Research Institute, Puskapol, also Kurawal, for making this happen for the Indonesian first seminar sharing. I will continue with the last research questions, particularly on the role of foreign funding on elite formation and elite interaction. So we have our elite donor here. We really hope Mas Darmawan could elaborate more from his own personal reflections on in relation to our finding in this research. What we found both in Cambodia and Indonesia is that financial support for NGO has been important aspect on the way in general promoting democracy in both countries, but it operates differently, right? So having said that, it doesn't mean that we are only focusing on NGO getting support from the donor, because there are many other case studies that we elaborate both in Indonesia and in Cambodia, also never receive any foreign funding, but from there we can see the difference and the pattern, what's the difference between those who are receiving foreign funding or not. But essentially, our second finding is that how this influence of process of elitizations, which cover formation, interaction, and boundary crossing. But again, this operates in two ways. Berikutnya, Mas. Yeah. The first one is the way foreign funding influence of what we call process of elitization. First, by shaping new civil society fields. For instance, over the past decade or 10 years, Mbak Dani or many here focus on the gender in politics, for instance. We didn't hear much, for instance, 20 years ago or 25 years ago. So that's really an example on how certain field, what we call field here, emerged due to facilitations of foreign funding, without which perhaps we will never have what we call undang-undang kekerasan sexual violence. So that's how foreign funding contribute to the process of first the creation of the field and then the creation of the elites. So that's what we find, the first one, shaping new civil society elite and support the emergence of new CSO dominating in this field. The second way how foreign funding influence process of elitization is through the various program. I think all of us here familiar how civil society can also usually facilitate activities such as leadership training, education, internal management and financial for those who are focusing on the financial or the managerial aspect. And again, for example, promoting gender equality among the organization, for instance. So that's really, I think some of us perhaps remember there are one period in Indonesia civil society whose director are all female. I think there are certain years, many Jakarta-based civil society has at least 7 organizations, if I remember correctly, they all have female leadership, which really required by the donor. That's what we mean by how the foreign funding influence process politicization through the education process. So, but again, another finding that we come out through this research is that when the elite or civil society elites become politician, what we call as boundary crossing or boundary crosser, foreign funding no longer important, because there is another source for them to be, to exercise their roles, which is coming from political party or state. So when it shifts to another field, the type of resource also shift. So if we are still in the civil society, donor is the source, but then when they move somewhere else, that's the different. Berikutnya, Mas. So another explanation on the reliance of foreign funding in information interaction is that what Astrid and Anders already mentioned. So it's not just about a specific type of capital. Yeah, it's not just about economic capital, but also social capital, but also then combine it, right? In Cambodia discussion, we are discussing about what we call a civil society capital. Perhaps this is what we can discuss, because there are typical type of capital which we don't see it in other type of elites. Perhaps we are still we can elaborate that more, But funding is not just about economic capital, but also social capital. Once civil society activists become elites, then perpetually they accumulate all type of capital. So what we are here now, we are actually meeting, we are perhaps future collaboration. This is all what our social capital is, right? Not really necessarily about economic capital. And later, when some of the activists, some of the elites become politicians, they convert it. So this capital can be converted from social, economic, become political capital when they become elites in a different field. Next. So that's our main finding on the roles of foreign funding. But from this research, we also think at least 5 questions for further research that we can discuss. Again, what Anders mentioned earlier in the beginning, we need perhaps to explore more what distinguishes civil society from elites from non-elites. Are they the same? Because classically we all know, elites play a role, Indonesia, oligarchy. What's the difference then between civil society elites and non-elites? If whether the civil society elites also part of oligarchy or not, we also another things that you can discuss. And the second is what distinguishes civil society elite from other elites, right? The second is the third is how can we analyze civil society elites? What tools? Does our instrument so far that we offer in this book, type of capital and also Bourdieuian strategic field, strategic action field, is it sufficient to make us understand this type of capital, this type of civil society elites or not? That's also another thing that we think is further research. What drives process of elitization? Is it again part of the funding donor, foreign donor that push process of elitization, or is it just a sociological process that naturally come about? And does it matter to discuss these civil society elites? This kind of reflection of further research, particularly if I may add, what's happening now in Indonesia, the recent on undang-undang penal code. Can we relate this penal code with this our book result on the elites? Does this civil society elites contribute to what we have now? That's also another question that we can elaborate empirically during the discussion. So another thing that we come out with this study is that we think it's also important to identify implications for studying civil society in Southeast Asia. So as mentioned earlier, this is a study of comparative between Indonesia and Cambodia. But again, from this study, we propose new research agenda in the future. First, on the power relation. So this is a political dimension of civil society that links civil society with the state and political and economic society. So we have civil society, economic society, state, or perhaps and political society. How does these relations, the power relation among these different fields? And the third is more on the theoretical approach, because we are in the campus, we are talking about this all the time. Whether the field theoretical approach can contribute to rethinking of civil society in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. Because if you are familiar with the studies of civil society, there's typical classical understanding on civil society, as a watchdog, as a control government, and recently, become part of the government or the state, but we wonder, or we identify implication on the field theoretical approach. And last but not least, another implication is that theory on civil society elites needs to engage more on the role of civil society for democracy and democratization. So that's why I mentioned our current situation in Indonesian politics for now on the penal code, which just come up last week. We always need to link this debate or discussion on civil society elites with democracy and democratization. Otherwise, it will just isolate it in itself. So I guess that's my part, and wanna directly to Desi and Indah. Indah first, perhaps.
Thank you. I would like to share the story. So the main question of this section is how does the development aid influence the reproduction of civil society elite? Yes, so to answer this question, we conducted a research, followed 3 organizations, CSOs, namely Foundation YLBHI, Legal Aid, Indonesian Legal Aid Foundation, and especially Jakarta Legal Aid Foundation, and ICW, the watchdog for anti-corruption, and Seknas Fitra, the National Secretary of Indonesian Anti-Corruption Forum. And so the CSOs, we use it for illustrating how the influence of the development aid in the field of human rights and anti-corruption field. So we found that the effect of foreign funding on elite reproduction is vary across the time and across the field. And we know that the foreign funding has been evolving in Indonesia since 1970s. And then we also has to underline here that the foreign funding is complementing the capitals which are already held by the elite of civil society or prominent figure in civil society, especially complementing the namely knowledge, organizational skill, and network and political access. Yes, and this is the story of the human rights field. So the emerging of the field associated with Adnan Buyung Nasution. We know that he was a very prominent figure as a public advocate, and he founded LBH in 1970s, followed by the foundation in 1981 for implementing structural legal aid, which viewed structural inequality as lying as a problem at the political system. And back then, the foreign funding supported the operation of how Adnan Buyung Nasution established the foundation. Like more than 80% of the operational budget in 1990s supported by Oxfam and Novib. And Adnan has these capacities because he also obtained the international degree. Yeah, he was graduated from University of Indonesia and then obtained the master and also the PhD from the Melbourne and Utrecht University. And we found as well that his close connection and work with INFIT network, International Foreign Aid Network, is also helped the foreign funding came to Indonesia. And also Adnan Buyung Nasution also have a close connection with the political actors at the time, especially Mendagri, the minister, and Ali Sadikin, Sumitro, and the Minister of Economy, Joyo Hadikusumo. So we underline that the foreign funding complemented what exactly held by Adnan Buyung Nasution. And the foreign funding support how the foundation, Legal Aid Foundation, operate systematically for especially selecting and kaderization, select the new cadres through Kalabahu. Is kind of an annual volunteer system, how to select the new cadre, and also make the foundation to have a standardization over the 16 offices in Indonesia. And also for, like for example, Mbak Linda already mentioned about the women leadership. It has been culturally implemented, but the foreign funding has supported and make it more institutionalized in the foundation, in the Legal Aid Foundation, and also how they advocate, like for example, the minority right and identity issue. And yeah, the story of the human rights field. So we found that since the human right, which is the LBH and YLBHI has supported and performed as a democratic locomotive, and then it makes the sector expanded into to initiate the anti-corruption field. The emerging of the anti-corruption field cannot be separated by the role of YLBHI, since the foundation frame corruption is not as an individual, but frame is as a structural problem which has a deep-rooted in a power system. And then the prominent actors in the anti-corruption field, the emerging the field, was initiated by the prominent figure back then. At the time, we have Teten Mas Dugi, who is known as a Ministry of Cooperation, and who has a close connection with the structuralist economists, and also some public advocates of the YLBHI at that time. And then Teten Mas Dugi was and established the ICW as a watchdog, and was chosen as the organization first leader. And we found that the role of the foreign funding here is supporting and facilitating how this ICW conduct selection systematically using Sakti, is a kind of a voluntarism mechanism to select the new cadre. And this kind of mechanism is complementing the existing mechanism, which was rather informal, and then through the funding help to systematically conducting the new mechanism. And also from this field, we also conducted research with FITRA, the National Secretary of FITRA, and we found that the foreign funding facilitates how these CSOs define the clean government and also good government, which shaping the field through their programs. So we found that between, like for example, to illustrate how the role of the fund here, 2000 to 2008, for example, FITRA received support from like a foundation, Asia Foundation and OpenGov, to encourage the participation in budgeting and to conduct the monitoring through the survey. Yeah, this is a story from the anti-corruption, and yeah, this is a kind of conclusion. So we underline that there are two intervening process, which is like a circle here. So at the first phase, we have we found that the hyper elite, that what we called for the men or the funders of the organization, got the support to accelerate their goals, instrumental goal for establishing the organization. And the foreign funding also accelerated how the hyper elite to transform their knowledge and also the network to establish the CSOs, and also make a kind of programs to define and to translate about not necessarily the international funding goals, but also their own individual goals. And the second phase here is helping the leaders to standardize the recruitment process and also the training process in a way that they have good opportunities to integrate their own motivation, their own goal, and also the habitus of activism through this formalized process in the CSOs. So this is like a circle, and how the foreign funding can influence indirectly, in the sense of this, in elite formation and reproduction. So that's all my presentation. Thank you. Mbak Desi.
Okay, thank you. I will invite all of us to look after that. Yeah. To look at the local level. I believe that all of us do understand that since democratization, there are vibrant development of civil society organizations in local level. And we look that especially since the declining of donor, there are tendencies that civil society activists become involved in stronger interactions with other elites, especially in state and in political fields. So we'd like to contribute to this discussion by understanding better, specifically about civil society elites' interaction in the local level. We have two research questions here. One is, how are the interactions between civil society elites and other elites in local level? And second is, what factors that shape the interaction? So to answer this question, I'd like to describe the two cases in Indonesia, which is Ininawa in Makassar, and the other is Bengkel Apek in Kupang. In doing so, we try to describe three forms of interactions, which are, one is civil society elites interaction with other civil society elites interactions at the local level. The second is civil society elites interaction with the local states actors. And the third is civil society elites interaction with the political elites. So concerning the three forms of the interaction, in the case of Ininawa Makassar, we see that, I will just say the brief finding, that civil society elites interaction with other civil society elites occurs predominantly with those with similar interest in knowledge production. So, as we will describe later, this tendency relates to the organization's main activities. But since there are rare interests in locality that works on the knowledge production, so they tend to expand their networks with other community outside Makassar. However, they still conduct interaction with other civil society elites in Makassar, but usually based on specific issues like through advocacy. In the chapter we mentioned about advocacy about Pasar Terong, it's traditional market, the forum that make all local civil society elites meet together. And in terms of second form of interaction, which is civil society elites interaction with state, it occurs most commonly around specific issues like working with village governments to implement capacity building programs. Those activities provide CSO leaders with accumulated capital that has allowed them to become civil society elites. And in the third form of interaction, which is interaction with the political elites, they conduct it more based on personal networking rather than from the advocacy activities. Interaction between leading members of Ininawa and political elites are not rooted in their social capital, but also their accumulated knowledge capital. These interactions with leading politicians have also been created and maintained through personal networks. From the case of Makassar, we suggest that the kinds of interactions could probably be influenced by the local context, the characteristic of local context, and also the characteristic of organization. Ininawa we know is established in Makassar, the city, the big city in eastern Indonesia, and then the city become home for hundreds of campuses, and that's why this organization was also built by university student. Ininawa actually is quite unique. It's not an organization, but it's kind of community having 5 sub-organizations. If the main community, the main organization or the main community is not registered, but the 5 sub-organizations are. I can mention some of them, like maybe some of you more familiar with these sub-organizations rather than the community stuff. For example, Kata Kerja, I didn't put it here. Kata Kerja is sub-organization that works on public library. And then they have Ininawa Press that works for publication. And then they have AXI, abbreviated from Active Society Institute, that they do advocacy in village governments, but now they shift their focus to urban poor. And then there are also School for Farmers, or SRP Payo Payo, which helps villages to obtain the comprehensive understanding of to the villagers. And then the 5th one is Tanete Institute, or TANI, which promotes organic farming. So as I mentioned before, the existence of these sub-organizations help the leaders of Ininawa to become an elite in local level. However, the dynamics that we found, in Ininawa is quite different with what we found in Kupang. In the case of Kupang, we discussed about one local NGO named Bengkel APEC. So different from Ininawa, Bengkel APEC is professional NGO. They work on issues of citizens' basic rights, and then in doing so, they have a strong relationship with the state elites from the very first time, because the organization is not only because the organization is registered formally with the state, but they have strong ties with the leading figures of state, because they try to meet the local government's agenda in delivering public service and in development issues. These characteristics of the organization, as well as their characteristic of locality, which we know that Kupang is the center or the capital city of Nusa Tenggara Timur, the underdeveloped province in Indonesia. So they they focus on a development issue. So these two characteristics, which is the locality as well as the form of organizations, really give a specific on the form of interaction. In the interaction with the state elites, we see that in the case of Kupang, it is more they present collaboration or symbiotic mutualism between the elites, the civil society elites and state elites. The civil society leaders derive economic and political capital from this process, while the state elites gain knowledge from this process of mutual benefits. And in the mutual interaction has stimulated the rise of boundary crossers practices. Such practices align more with the personal agendas rather than the organization one. And in the third form of interaction, which is interaction with the political elites, it's not very new that they are quite common among leaders in CSO and Kupang, that they present some, the interaction become a way for them to become boundary crossers, become politicians, I mean. Yes, something that we call boundary crossers in this book. And many of them doing it through electoral channels as well as non-electoral channels. And through electoral channels, for example, by entering political parties and when they do the non-electoral channels, because once they do they conducting advocacy, then they can like popularity among the society, and then how they get the famous, become the famous in Kupang. And from the two cases, we conclude that interactions between civil society elites and other elites is based on, they are vary in the form and the extent, and it is because you know the orientation and focus of CSOs, the level of dependence to the state, and the local context in which they operate. It's all influenced the pattern of interaction between them. And I think that's all from me about you know, the story about locality, and I think maybe we can discuss more after this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation from Indonesian research team. So, yeah, I have several questions, but I think it's much appropriate for me to give this floor to Mas Darmawan from Kurawal, as he wants to have response to what the research team right now have. Okay, I thought that you want to stay there. Okay, Mas Darmawan, please.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to give the response to the presentation from the research team of Lund University and the UI and UGM. So first disclaimer, I'm not a scholar. I spent my career in donor organizations, so this perspective that I offer as a response is a response from practitioners. And as part of donor community, I was responsible in the elitization of civil society. I have to admit, I have my hand dirty on that. Second, although Kurawal Foundation worked with Open Society Foundation in Cambodia, but we work mostly with the political dissident and the actual political party leaders, opposition leaders. So we don't have any intensive interaction with the Cambodian civil society, so I will limit my response to Indonesia case. So when Puskapo asked me to give response before I read the book, this is the main question that popped up in my head that I hope the research can give answer to. Is it good or bad for democracy? This is the holy grail for us, because Kurawal and other CSO and donors that choose to stay in the civil society spheres and preach this engagement want confirmation that elite polarization, elitization of civil society is bad. Or, even if we were wrong, that elitization of civil society is good for democracy, we want a robust explanation that can give us input to change our strategy. But before we come to that, let me highlight 3 takeaways from this research that I think all of us need to take note. Mas ini aja mas, belum. So the first, the book, the research is important work because it offers a thorough and systematic analysis on one phenomenon that we are aware of, but have difficulties to articulate as civil society. We are aware that there is a elitization, elitization of civil society, but to articulate it into a systematic discussion, we have difficulties. So This work provides foundation for not only further queries, but more coherent discussion among civil society about the phenomenon. But on the other hand, the point of view that the research offers should not be the only point of view to understand the phenomenon. So it should form counter-analysis using other point of view that can provide alternative understanding on phenomenon that happen in civil society. Hopefully, it can spark further and more coherent discussion. Second, the second takeaways that I found interesting is the choice of under case studies. Comparing Cambodia and Indonesia, who has different trajectories on civic space and democratization, but at the end found similar what we call trend. It stressed the point that elitization is a natural phenomenon that you can neglect, that you have to accept as a fact, and you have to respond. Even if you expand your analysis to other Southeast Asian countries like Timor-Leste, for example, I believe there will be the same trend. Because in Timor-Leste, there's a belief that people who is in the NGO is the next government official. People who wait in the wing to cross boundary to political and executive sphere. The third takeaway is, I think, the role of the international funding agencies. Belum masing satu lagi. International funding agencies. The donors have influence on the phenomenon due to their the policy of the distribution of resources, but also how they ask the civil society to mainstream the strategy to match the interest of the donors. It should become the reflection for donor community that their choice of strategy, their choice of policy have a major implications to the civil society that they have to support. And it strengthens the plea from Kuawal, for example, to the donors that they should act as a collective rather than individual donors if they want to strengthen the civil society. So let's go back to the question. Is it civil society elites good or bad for democracy? After reading the book, I found that that's not the question addressed by the research. So you will not find the definite answer for this question. This is a huge gap, because that's the question that we really have to answer, especially the latest elitization under Jokowi regime. We want to know. We have the answer for ourselves, but we need a confirmation. But other than not addressing the questions that we really want to know the answer of, there are also other gaps in the analysis that are important to understand the current process, the current elitization process. But before that, I will try to summarize some quote from the research that can lead us to that missing gap. So, so this is quote from the book. So it is important that the research define civil society elite is a group of people who have dominant position and ability to influence even beyond their sphere. It is also important for the research to define that civil society is a political space for non-state actors to influence politics. That the process of elitization and inequalities matters. The next slide, please. Important to know, to stress that the research also define that the boundaries among the four spheres is blurred. And that capital that enable the elites from civil society to do the boundary crossing is social capital and knowledge capital. That's why the next slide, please. The stability is important. Because the elite in civil society only have social and what the other? Social and knowledge capital. When they try to cross boundaries through political election, direct political election process, that's costly, they don't have financial resources to complete. That's why they have the shortcut to the government, because the capital that they have more relevant with that opportunity. But for others, if you use Titan as example, you must consider the other capital. There's an inside story circulated among us that explain why Pak Teten always survive various reshuffle under Pak Jokowi. It is believed that there are only two people in the cabinet that can make Pak Jokowi laugh. It's Teten and Pratikno. So you must consider the capital of humor and the ability to entertain the leader as one. But this is important. But explain because even the elite, they only have such capital that enable them to cross boundaries. The next. So that's the implication. Civil society elites become elites because their ability to secure resources from their interaction with other spheres. Either this financial resources or political protection. And dominant sphere that they can access, that they get their resources, is changed over time in the last 20 years, as well as the process and the form of resources. So I think that's missing component of your research that I found important to be addressed. So this is my kind of diagram. Lanjutkan. In the last 20 years, there are three parallel processes that happen along with the elitization of civil society. First, higher degree of cross-boundary activities, higher tendency of elite individualization, that to become an elite, you don't have to represent any organization in the civil society. You just become individual. Like what Pak Jokowi do with the relawan, so-called relawan. They don't represent any formal organization in the civil society, but they can become elite and have influence in the civil society. And the third is the rapid decline in democracy, especially under Jokowi government. So if we compare three stages the last 20 years when the elitization of civil society happened, we have the late years of New Order, pre-Jokowi, and Jokowi. That represent three different forces, three different characteristics of elitization. In the New Order, you become an elite if you can secure protection from the government or from the government repression. So people in organizations like INFIT, Legal Aid Foundation, that have the protection and access to international community, they become elite. People from organizations like PKBI, who can get along with the government, they become elite. And if you look further, there is very limited cross-boundary activity. During Soeharto is like between Real Madrid and Barcelona. There's no transfer of players among Barcelona and Real Madrid, for example. It's very stark. In pre-Jokowi time, after the reformations, the interaction with the foreign donors influenced how the elitization happened, especially through access to financial resources and technical assistance. This is the time when the cross-boundary activities began to happen. Why? One of them is because donor policy. Donor preach critical engagement. You need to engage with the government. You need to be inside of the government body. In this era, you will have what I call the technocratization of the NGOs. NGOs become more technocratic than the government. They try to replace the government role in policy making. And the second is go politics. It's not enough to be in the executive, but you need to go to the politics. But during Jokowi, the pendulum swings. The elitization during Jokowi era is driven by the state. For access for political influence and protection, not resistance. Sorry. So the cross-boundary activities is explode during Jokowi era. It's an exodus. The gate is open and it becomes co-optation. Why? Because elite of civil society that inside the government is working for the government interest, no longer promoting the interest of civil society. And why this has happened? The only explanation is because Jokowi don't trust political agenda. He has limited weak root to the political parties. He doesn't trust political parties. So he looks for source of legitimacy and power outside political parties. Either co-opting the police force, armed force, and civil society. That's the only explanation why after second election, 3 years after get re-elected, he still maintained the so-called Relawan organization. Because he needed to counterbalance the pressure of political parties. And is this true? That we have an important question to answer in the next election. Should we elect the president that doesn't have root in political party, that can copy the strategy of Jokowi to co-opt non-political actors to sustain his power. That's the question that need to answer, if that's true. But we believe the elitization under Jokowi is bad for democracy. We hope we can confirm that from your research in the second phase of the next round of research. But let me close my response with this meme. Terakhir, Mas. Mau kembali ke dalam. It's honestly, forgive my language, bullshit. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mas Darmawan atas. Sorry, thank you, Mas Darmawan, for the really engaging response towards the research on civil society elites. It's quite interesting because, if I may to simplify, it's the question about cross boundaries between the CES elite and the state and political elite seems undermine the democracy itself, right? So this kind of question that also I have in mind when I saw the research program of civil society elite. So there are several questions as well that coming from the participant that from the YouTube, but I'm just curious first about the question that being posed by Mas Darmawan here. So it's really interesting if the research team can address the question first, and then we can continue to the question that coming from the participant. So, Professor Anders, if you want to respond, please.
Thank you so much for this brilliant discussion of our book. I think that, well, you said that you are not a researcher. This is from a practitioner perspective, but I think this table where you compare the late New Order and the pre-Jokowi Reformasi era and the Jokowi government, that's a brilliant analysis, which I would have been happy if we had included that kind of analysis in the concluding chapter of the book. I think it's extremely useful. And this question on democracy is, of course, central. And I'm happy that you raised this question, and I think that's good. I should mention that a month ago, I participated in a similar discussion about civil society elites in London, UK. I'm involved in another research project on European civil society elites. And we had a seminar with quite prominent leaders of British civil society organizations. And in that presentation, I raised the question of democracy, and I had a discussion about how, in theory, civil society is expected to contribute to democracy, and what a process of elitization could mean for the possibilities for civil society actors to fulfill these expectations that we have of civil society to be promoting democracy. And the reaction there was not at all. They were not concerned about democracy. I didn't get any feedback on the democracy issue, or any kind of how process within civil society damage or damage democracy and lead to the decline of democracy. So I think it's really promising that the central question, oh sorry, this is the central question indeed here in Indonesia. I think that's an advantage compared to the UK. So to briefly try to address this question, I think, of course, it depends on what your perspective on democracy is. So from a kind of conventional electoral understanding of democracy, there might be advantages in having civil society elites if you think that the main purpose of civil society organizations is to influence policies, influence politics in a more democratic direction, more human rights oriented direction and so on. Having civil society elites in the understanding of having well-qualified people at the top of civil society organizations who also have access to people in power and so on. This might be good for democracy. But on the other hand, there are of course many aspects of the process of education within civil society that is against a positive view and contribution to democratization, and more in line with the argument of a decline for democracy. And especially if you have a somewhat more participatory view of what democracy should be, and of course, legislation, the formation of a league is problematic. And for many reasons as well. But I think this is a kind of academic answer, but it's not black and white. It's not only good or bad for democracy. It depends on how we understand democracy, and it depends on what kind of elitization. But if elitization means that those on the top, at the top of civil society become increasingly isolated from the grassroots, then of course this is a severe problem for democracy. But if the civil society leaders that move into politics maintain their kind of grassroots connection and grassroots base, and manage to really influence politics, then it would be good. That would be my brief reply to this very important question. And I think maybe others would like to.
Yeah. Astrid, you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Just
please.
briefly, yeah, I think it was, yeah, I agree, it's a brilliant, you were asking brilliant questions. And I think that somehow in this project, we did manage to, in a way, depoliticize a deeply political topic in a way that was sometimes confusing. But the way that I see this, at least, this goes back to how we understand civil society elites in this sort of, value-free way, harking back to how we see this sort of normal social phenomenon that in any social activity, any kind of organization, there will always be processes of leadership. So per se, I wouldn't say that, I don't think that question can be asked, is it good or bad for democracy? The way that I see this project is that we open up the door and give sort of theoretical tools for an empirical analysis in any given context. And so I think the answer will for sure vary. And so the table that you included there, I think that's brilliant and is important for analysis of how the dynamic has looked like in Indonesia. I don't think it can be in the conclusion of the book, because I think it's separate. You're looking at a particular context, and that is the result that you would get. And so to me, this is also the most pressing and important question to address in a way, but it's something that sort of, this kind of analysis, you're able to do this kind of analysis by doing the sort of, I don't know, I mean, you know, this kind of groundwork in a way opens up the door to that important question. So for myself, I've been doing research along those lines when it comes to Cambodia. And so I looked at those two different contexts that I alluded to. So one is and you will know a lot about that since you work with Cambodian political exiles, but the people who set up opposition political parties and sort of their results in democratic terms. And so that's a very particular situation. And then you have another very particular situation, which is the people who go to the state-sponsored organizations and then are able to join the state's elites and so on. And I mean, and that's a phenomenon that is, you know, it's plain to see to anyone who's observing politics. But there was just, you know, there was no particular way of framing it. So the conversation sort of died down. There was no way of really analyzing that dynamic. Whereas having, you know, spending these years on this project made, you know, in a way, sort of made me better equipped, I think, to approach that question and put that into a larger context with, you know, these comparative dimensions. So yeah, that would be my answer. But I think you really raised the elephant in the room, let's say.
Yeah, from the Indonesian research team, are there any comments on Mas Darmawan? Yeah, please.
Thank you, Mas Darmawan and the participants. I want to add with some theoretical and methodological note. On our research, when we are defining civil society, we choose the single issue civil society engagement. We don't take like the big ormas as civil society like NU and Muhammadiyah, in which their engagement are, I mean, on all every issues. And in that case, then we kind of specify on reformasi related civil society. So we ignore the conventional civil society, big one, which engage in society not only in terms of changing the way of governing, but also in terms of representative. NU Muhammadiyah used to have engagement in political parties and so forth, and we didn't really take into account. Secondly, what make this analysis lively is the use of virtue theory of field, and more specifically, we use the strategic field aspect of it, and then when we talk about elite, we refer to individual rather than structure, categorical structure like elite and masses on sociological term, and by that, then we can show the dynamic of elite, including the boundary crossing processes. So the choice allows us to have a detailed dynamic, but we kind of ignoring the big picture and doing the dynamic. And the notion of elitization is because we are observing the single issue from small organizational engagement. It's like LPH depend on a small elite on legal engagement and so forth. So because they are starting from small organization and then climb up within the whole structure of state, then we are making comment on and theorizing the process, we call it elitization. This is because they are choosing a small element of civil society from single issues. For example, if we use the categorical analysis, elite and masses, in the Marxian theory, then the category will be different, because the social capital in NU, for example, allows people to have a big role in the beginning because of the religious capital, and then just shifting to the government through representative process. For example, Gus Yakut, from elite of Kiai, and then as he then become the Ministry of Religious Affairs, then not not needed for discussing because the civil society have already traditional sit within the government structure to political representation. So this is not the aspect that we are talking about. So by using budget theory about field, and there are different capital, different field to play around, then we are very rich in closing, in demonstrating the dynamic of elite, including the elitization. But again, we are not devoted to describe elitization as good and bad, but because the struggle are going upward, then elitization is natural. And this is like sociological normality in a way. And everywhere in the world, there is no such thing as equal for everybody. There will always be elite on the ground. Secondly, the way we define democracy is also direct us to different way of describing civil society elite. For example, when we define democracy inevitably or has to be adversarial process, then we are complaining changing from inside is impossible. So this is because the way we define democracy inevitably has to be adversarial, and because this is not always or not the only way to define democracy, then we can make a discussion about it. So from between and from without is not really issue. It became dependent on the way we define what democracy is. But the liberal democracy tend to contradict the engagement from state and society. If not contradiction, then not democracy. This is a different spirit of debate. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to proceed to the questions that coming from floor. Yeah, from Sofian, and there are two questions that coming from participants in online space. So okay, Sofian and sorry, yeah, Mr. with the hat, and two questions then. I mean with the
Dr. Wija
cap. Yeah, please. Sofian, you might want to raise your question.
Yes. Thank you so much for the presentations and then the opportunity to ask questions. I'm not studying politics per se. I'm studying anthropology. So in my wild imaginations, I'm imagining about the life cycle of these elites, the CSO elites, because I was intrigued by the notion that the border crossers kind of stuff like that. So I imagine like how about we conceptualize the life cycle of these elites, whether or not after they cross the boundaries, whether they are going back to the CSO after they hold positions within the regime or not, or what happened next after they cross the borders, and whether or not this is different from other kind of elites or oligarchs type of category in how they maintain the positions and etc. And whether or not the team find similarities between Cambodia and Indonesia in that sense. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next.
Thank you. So it's so good to be here with so many familiar faces. My name is Wijayanto. I am the director of LP3IS. So I'm kind of elite too, but yeah. But not nggak elit-elit amat sih. But not. Ya, halo Astrid, Mbak Linda, and of course Pak Pur and Prof Anders ya. So I have actually we did research. We're still doing it now. LP3IS and SafeNet. Mbak Linda is one of the informants that we invited. I asked her question back then, and the answer from her back then was not so clear. So I would like to raise again the question here. Maybe now it's clearer, the answer. when we're doing this research, the first obstacle that we face is, at the first place, the definition of civil society, right? There are, of course, a lot of definitions, but the way to see it as a value, as a association in a Tocquevillian way, or as a public sphere, referring to Gramsci. And in relation with it, then my question to this project is how you define it. Of course, Pak Purwo, good to see you again, Pak Purwo. We were in Maastricht 2017, right? And now you look fresh as it was before. On definition will then have a lot of consequences. Because why I said that elite society is not elite amat, I feel myself, even though I'm elite of LPDGS, for instance, I don't feel elite. Why? If we judge it from influence, I guess, there are influencers like Dennis Siregar is more influencer than me, right? I guess nobody knows me, but everybody knows him. Yeah, Kang Panji, ya. And then, if we see from the resource, tadi Mas Darmawan proposed something about resource.
I'm sorry, Mas. Can you please be brief because we have.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Resource. Then the role of donor. Mas Darmawan also addressed himself that there's also influencing us and the program. So the second question would be how I don't know whether this research also do a mapping of civil society. Yeah. I guess as far as I know, in Indonesia, the systematic formulation of the mapping of civil society is conducted by Mansur Fakih in 1990s, I guess, based on his dissertation. That's the serious one. And now we haven't seen it. So our project is actually the mapping of civil society today in what basis, and the mapping will have to consider how we define it. Right? Because we think that our old way defining civil society as in a Tocquevillian sense, as association, maybe is no longer enough. Because not just with Dennis Siregar, a lot of activism in a reform era, especially after 2019, is not, I guess, merely initiated by civil society. There are a lot of movements going on there. That is, people call it as, more rhizomatic, referring to Deleuze and Guattari, like the one in the movement of K-popers, or akademisi menolak revisi undang-undang KPK, and many other things. It happens like simultaneously, almost, and it's not initiated by. We cannot address it to just one or two civil society in a Tocquevillian sense. Thank you.
Thank you. And then next questions coming from one of the participants, which asks about the difference between elite and oligarchy in here. So the research team might want to address this question. And another question with regards to the methodology coming from Bufalina, in which she asks about why comparing Indonesia and Cambodia. What is the methodological reason for this comparison, and then why these three NGOs that being research object in here, like that, because there are many NGOs with different issues that might be useful to become the object of research. So yeah, anyone from the research team? Yeah.
Maybe I will take. Thank you all for the questions. Mas Wija, thank you for coming, and others who are coming and about to leave, thank you again for joining us. I perhaps will deal with the. It's very interesting that you asked question about life cycle. We haven't thought about it though. Life cycle of an elite in comparison to the oligarchy. Also the last question, the question from the YouTube. We haven't really thought about positioning these civil society elites within the life cycle, which is, I find it really personally I find it really interesting. And when we compare with the oligarchy still needs a definition. Yeah, I mean, my gentleman here is also an expert on oligarchy. I think we need to clarify. If you follow oligarchy from one perspective, it's really like a system of accumulation, right? That's really specific understanding on system of accumulation of wealth. I mean, if we do this research maybe in the next 20 years or so, and civil society already become a new established and institutionalized agency, I mean, elites, perhaps we can, identify the same pattern, but I'm not really sure whether we can have that comparison at this current, even though Mas Darmawan already show us that within the 3 different periods, it's actually operate differently, but I myself personally will not too sure that it is comparable, because it's a different type of resources, it's different type of capital, it's a system of accumulation. But if you again, this is really a debate or a very engaging discussion that, I mean, thank you for the question, but if we define the accumulation of, I mean, wealth is not just in terms of financial, but also knowledge that we identify here, then it can be, but it needs to be defined and it needs to be responded differently. Not really, I don't think it's comparable between wealth accumulation and knowledge accumulation. It's really a different way. So maybe that's a bit touching the question from the YouTube between the oligarchy and the elites. I think what we refer here, the elites, is still in a very typical traditional way, rather than a very system of accumulations. That will be my take on the 2 questions that perhaps others can also add.
No? Yes. Good. So there was a question about the life cycle of boundary crosses and so on, what happens. And I think in our studies, most of the cases of boundary crossing that we have investigated are people moving from leading positions in civil society, moving into politics or the state, and not moving back again. But this is, of course, more of an empirical focus, especially in the case of Indonesia, I think. In general, of course, we can also think about people moving back and forth and being active in more than one field at the same time. There is even a concept for that, the boundary spanners instead of boundary crossers. So boundary spanners are holding elite positions both in civil society and in electoral politics or in the state or in the business world simultaneously. On the definition of civil society, I would say that we are not very precisely drawing on either liberal or Gramscian understandings of civil society. I think it's I mean, our contribution is the field approach, and understanding civil society as a field or several fields means that we focus on the hierarchical stratification of civil society. So that would mean that we are closer to the kind of Gramscian understanding of civil society, I would say, taking this approach. Unfortunately, we didn't map civil society in Indonesia or Cambodia, and we didn't even map civil society elites. So we can't give this kind of overarching picture, unfortunately. and yeah, what more? A question about the comparison between Indonesia and Cambodia and the rationale for this. We got an exact same question last week when we did this in Cambodia. But yeah, I think besides the practical, pragmatic question of having a research interest and research competence on the two countries, the rationale has been that it's interesting to see how the different trajectories in the two cases in terms of shrinking and expanding political space result in quite similar processes of elitization despite the differences. So it's the relative democratization versus relative autocratization that is the important difference between the two cases. Yeah, did I?
Something. Yeah, I think on the question of the life cycle, I'd say this is a delimitation that we made at the outset. So we mentioned that we're aware that these processes can be cyclical, or they can be multidirectional, move, come back, and so on. But our empirical cases shows to focus on people crossing from civil society to another field. But I do think that it would be interesting actually to take a more sort of expansive look at this. And then you would also see, I mean, I would say in the case of Cambodia, it would be very difficult to come back to civil society once you have left. Maybe that's different in Indonesia, I'm not sure. But that kind of analysis and also that kind of comparative analysis would also say something about how you sort of burn your capital, perhaps you burn your civil society capital that Linda mentioned once you have crossed. So that's something that would be interesting to consider. The mapping, perhaps we didn't do comprehensive mapping, but we did try to look at activism where it happens. So in the case of Cambodia, it's important to us not to look at so much at formal associations, but looking at recent initiatives that have proven to be important points of activism, also sometimes precisely because of the boundary crossing attached to it. So we looked at different platforms, many of them several identified as platforms or forums, networks of forest activism, and so on. So in that sense, we did make a statement on where we see civil society in Cambodia to be located.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, this would be our last session because it's already 3. But I would like to open 3 questions from the floor, and yeah, that will be it. So other question? Yeah, please, Huria. Yeah.
Thank you for all the speakers and researchers. This is very interesting discussion. I want to continue from the question that Mas Darmawan raised, whether civil society elites good or bad for democracy. From this finding, I find that the problem of elitization in civil society is indeed problematic for Indonesian democracy. But it might be important as well if we look at other civil society organizations such as women civil society in Indonesia. Because in the case of women civil society organizations, the importance of having civil society elites in order to advocate women's representation issues, women interests, is proven essential. For instance, the issuance of Undang-Undang TPKS, sexual harassment. I forgot the. Yeah, anti-sexual harassment law, and also advocacy to promote potential woman leader in political parties and in the parliament, and also in the electoral management bodies. So there are other segment of civil society that really needs the process of elitization as well, to help them connect with the NGOs so that they can promote civil society agenda. So it might be, you know, like important to look other dimension as well. So there is no black and white answer, I think, for the question, but it confirms that civil society in Indonesia is multifaceted. We have seen cases where elitization is bad for our democracy, but we also can see some elitization is not really that bad for democracy, but it actually helps civil society to influence political sphere. Thank you.
Okay. Other question? If not, so we can give this question to the research team, and then I will close it with the closing statement, please. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mbak Ria, for this important question. And to get back to Mas Darmawan point on the reflection whether this is good or bad for democracy. First of all, Anders already mentioned that the intention of this book is not to the direction of labeling whether good or bad, but we want to understand more and why this is happening. But again, I understand that it's unavoidable, right, to really reflect this, particularly in Indonesia current situations where Mas Darmawan mentioned also, and other books also already explore on the declining quality, illiberal and all that. So I can understand, we can understand this is a very pressing, difficult to not connecting it. But I think from your point, Mbak Ria, and combining with Mas Darmawan, it shows that there are varieties, right, on the impact on civil society elites in democracy, particularly democracy in terms of, Anders already mentioned, on influencing policies. It's really, I mean, if you talk about democracy in terms of grassroots movement, watchdog, there will be perhaps different. So we have different layers of discussion here. First on the field, on the field and on the sectors, whether the question is whether all of the sectors benefit or not benefit from civil society elites. And second, what type of democracy are we referring to? If a policy influencing, I'm sure the forms of elites in one way or another is needed because it's a kind of lobbying, right? And you use usually the term or language which is very technocratic, as Darmawan also mentioned. So it naturally needed to be there. But again, if you are talking about democracy in terms of how you improve social movement, watchdog, that will be a different skill, different need to be addressed. And that's really, again, showing a different way of how civil society elite or impact on democracy. Perhaps, I mean, my take from your point is that how it will be different, I mean, in terms of bad or good, and different types of democracy. I guess that's my take on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Anders or Astrid or anyone? If not, give really big applause for us, all of us. For it's really an engaging question, and I think the question that being raised by Mas Darmawan is timely because, yeah, this is just my understanding of elite studies. There are plenty elite approach actually, like not only Bourdieuian, but there are like classical elite study coming from Mosca, Pareto, and even modern elite study, Mills, Floyd Hunter, and even new elite paradigm, which basically try to make a claim about elite cohesion important in sustaining democracy. So the further research program is huge from this research, and I think it can become an opportunity for all of us who wants to pursue more understanding about civil society, elite, and power structure in the society, it's really important intervention here. So yeah, without further ado, thank you everyone for involved in this discussion. It's really engaging discussion, and I hope we can meet again in another occasion. And thank you for Andres Loon, Astrid, and Indonesian research team for present this valuable work on political science. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Okay, and then
As usual, as part of Indonesian tradition during meetings, let's close this event with a photo session all together. Maybe we can all come forward.